Greetings. Welcome to the DragonCon Urban Fantasy Track author interview series. I am joined today by longtime friend of the track, AJ Hartley, and we are going to talk about all of his many works and just give people a good background on AJ and what you can expect when you start delving into his work. AJ, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time.
Now, the first question that I always ask everybody, because and I guess it's always kind of obvious to me, is just from an interest standpoint, is did you read fantasy and sci-fi as a child or a young adult?
Yeah, of course, in those days, because I was growing up in the early 14th century, um, there wasn't what we today recognize as a YA field, so there was sort of children's literature that had a fantasy bent, the sort of C.S. Lewis, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe type series. Those were some of the first things that I remember reading and getting excited about. But I kind of went from that sort of stuff straight to Tolkien, not Hobbit, straight into The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And Ursula Le Guin, Wizard of Earthsea, those sorts of books. So kind of hopping over stuff that was specifically supposed to be for adolescents, and started reading, fairly widely in adult fantasy. I mean, I wasn't just reading fantasy; I was reading mystery and thriller and various other things as well. But yeah. So I always did read it. Yeah.
Okay. Now, your academic backgrounds are very interesting in terms of archaeology and Shakespeare. And I mean, that Shakespeare studies has consumed an awful lot of your adult life and and continues to do so. And for which
consumed is the word. Consumed is exactly the word.
Okay, there you go. Consumed, not occupied. Yeah, and how did those things influence what you ended up or what you have done more recently? What was kind of the impetus for you to move into writing fiction?
I mean, the archaeology stuff. When I went to university, I was an English major, and in those days, I don't know if it's changed, but in the UK, there was no such thing as a minor. And so you did, and there was no general education. If you did an English degree, you did nothing but English literature, including like no American literature. It was you spent the first year learning Anglo-Saxon so that you could read Beowulf in your second year, kind of thing. And that was exclusively what you did, which, in certain respects is great. But I was also, I've always been interested in lots of different things, and I got the chance to start taking Egyptology classes, which had nothing to do with anything. But so I was doing those on the side, and that was how I found my way into archaeology. And I worked briefly as an archaeologist in Israel on an early Bronze Age site near Jerusalem. After I left my undergraduate institution, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do, and I decided I didn't really want to become a professional archaeologist. So I went to Japan, where I taught for a couple of years, and then came to the US and went to graduate school after about a year of traveling around Southeast Asia. So I was still really interested in archaeology and history and such, but by then I was also writing fiction because, as you said, I've written a lot, I've published a lot, but all my fiction has come out within the last 20 years. I had actually been writing long fiction for about 20 years before any of it came out.
Oh.
So, because again, this was, before the flood, and there was no such thing as self-publishing in those days. So you either got a big press or you got nothing. So I wrote a lot. I think I wrote 8 complete novels before I published anything. And And by then I was in graduate school and I was studying to become a Shakespeare professor, which is what I have been for the last 30 years. But I was always writing fiction at the same time. So all these sort of different interests, especially the stuff that I was not doing professionally, started to intersect in my creative writing, and so the first novels that I had published were mystery thrillers that had a kind of archaeological component: Mask of Atreus, On the Fifth Day, What Time Devours, Tears of the Jaguar, and these were all sort of adventure stories that grew out of some kind of archaeological discovery of some sort, and they were hot at the time because they came out right after the Da Vinci Code.
Ah, yes.
Right. So
Gotcha.
there was suddenly a market for these books, some of which I had been working on for a number of years and never got anywhere. And then suddenly publishers were like, oh, yeah, we want more of those. And of course, they published so many of them in those years immediately after the Da Vinci Code that the market got glutted. And after a while, no publisher wanted to see anything looking like an archaeological mystery unless it was written by Steve Berry, right?
Oh, yes.
He's pretty much the only one to survive, and he's still doing them. God bless him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I sort of thought, well, okay, I need to move into other things. And I was already working on my first fantasy novel, much to my agent's panic, because I remember having conversations with her. It's like, so you're a thriller writer, and I'm like, no, I just happen to have written a thriller which has been, successful. But as you know, because I'd had the same agent for years, I've written a lot of stuff. And she's like, yeah, but now you're publishing as a thriller writer. And I'm like, yeah, but there's this epic fantasy thing that I want to do. And she's like, no, because, this is not what you're supposed to do, especially in traditional publishing. You're supposed to create a brand, a specific professional identity, and you're supposed to do that pretty much forever, and it's smart. It's a great way to build your audience and to build your own visibility and so on. But I never wanted to do that. I always wanted to write lots of different things because I always read lots of different things. So why would I write this? It's like a friend of mine. No, I shouldn't say that. I won't talk about let's say this. I know thriller writers who have become very, very successful for writing books about one character. And the books are so similar and designed to be similar so that you can read them in any order, right? So that if you're not like really invested in this particular series, you can just pick one off the shelf and read it and it will work, which means that the character cannot really evolve in the course of a single novel because people come back for the same thing over and over and over again, right? It's like a James Bond story or something. You don't expect James Bond to change radically from the beginning to the end of the book, because in the next book, he's going to be right back where he was at the start of the last one, right? And while I get that, and particularly I get it as a marketing strategy, the idea of it bores the pants off me.
Right.
So
well, that's understandable. Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't want to do that. So much to my agent's chagrin, yes, I sent her my first sort of snarky fantasy adventure, and she's like, what the hell is this? But anyway, yeah. So so I did that, and then I've done some, I've done science fiction, I've done some for kids, some for young adult, some adult, and they often revolve around some of those same old interests. They often have a historical or archaeological component. They often have a core mystery, regardless of what the genre is. And sometimes they involve, they always kind of involve Shakespeare thematically. I mean, not like quoting Shakespeare, but a lot of the things that I get excited about Shakespeare tend to surface in my in
Right.
my fiction. And from time to time, I've written things that are expressly Shakespearean. My last novel was actually called Burning Shakespeare, which was a sort of time travel-y adventure thing about somebody who hated Shakespeare so much he wanted to sell his soul to the devil so he could go back and wipe him from history. So, so that was my opportunity to sort of, get all my Shakespearean angst out and through my fiction.
Well, it's very effective, I might add.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Now, speaking of your variety, I have a very long list here of the books that you've written. And so, what I thought we might do is go through that. And some of them I have physical copies of, such as
Oh,
this one.
wow. You got one of those. I haven't seen one of those in years.
Yeah, and what I thought maybe we could do, or you could do, is can you tell our viewers, anyone who sees this, there may be people who that you are a new author to them. It could be that they came to your work for one specific series, but they don't really know that much about the others. So can you give us kind of a very brief, synopsis, not a synopsis necessarily, maybe like an elevator pitch of
Sure.
what some of these books are about. So,
This is
so
the
people
AJ
can
Hartley
have an
bingo
idea.
section.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Now, your first published book was The Mask of Atreus, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. And you said that one had the archaeological historical background, and then the next one was On the Fifth Day, but they're not connected, right? They're standalones. Is that
Well,
correct?
see, I can't even do this.
Yeah.
They are obliquely connected
Okay.
in that the lead character in the first one shows up as a secondary character in the second, which makes no publishing marketing sense at all, but I wanted to do it.
Well, and from
And
a
then
reader's standpoint, though, that's something we love.
right.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, but they were pitched as standalones. Each one is a sort of self-contained story. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, but then some of the characters continue and sort of intersect in subsequent books. Yeah.
Okay. Now, this What Time Devours has a very
Right.
Shakespearean theme. So, what can you tell us about that one?
Yeah. That I guess that was the first time that I allowed Shakespeare to consciously enter my fiction, and it's a story about a lost play. It's a novel, a thriller, realist thriller. It's not fantasy, about a lost play manuscript called Love's Labour's Won. Right, we know
Hmm.
of Love's Labour's Lost and Love's Labour's Won, which I think, and I think most scholars think, did exist. We have references to it. We even have references that suggest it was published, but we don't have any of them. And we don't know exactly what happened to it. I mean, it's not uncommon in the period. We've lost a lot of plays, but most of the Shakespeare is accounted for. But Love's Labour's Won is not. So this is a thriller that was me sort of saying, what would happen if somebody found a copy of this play? How would they try to make money off it? What would they do with it? What
Yeah.
might other people want to do to them to get hold of it? And then sort of weave that into a sort of a darker story about other kinds of elements that intersect within the story. So, I mean, when I frame it like that, it sounds quite whimsical. It's not actually. It's quite a serious book, and it has some. It was I think at the time it was probably my most personal book to date. Not just because of the Shakespeare stuff, but because there was having some sort of family health issues and stuff, and that informs in that novel as well. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I believe that the fantasy novels that your foray into the foray into fantasy that your agent was a little concerned about had to do with Will. Am I correct?
That's right. Oh
Yeah.
wow, you've got the original covers. Yes. Yeah.
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 Yes. So
So those were
tell us about Will Hawthorne.
Yeah. So Will Hawthorne, these were published by Tor back in what, 2011, something like that. Maybe earlier. I'm not sure.
2009 and 2010, according to the
2009
information
and
I
10.
have.
Okay, good. So yes, they are snarky first-person adventure stories set in a world that looks kind of like Renaissance England a little bit. And they center on Will Hawthorne, who at the start of the first book is an 18-year-old actor and writer who falls foul of the authorities and gets involved with effectively a party of adventurers, right? And Will doesn't believe in anything, particularly magic and supernatural, but also things like trust and loyalty and friendship. He's very cynical. Yeah, he thinks all that stuff's nonsense. So the first book is about him sort of running headlong into a whole bunch of things he doesn't believe in, and having to sort of deal with them. And then the second one, Willpower, extends that story and pushes it even further, puts him in a kind of Tolkien-esque world where it's sort of elves and goblins fighting each other, but the story hinges on it's a book that I really love still, because it's a story that hinges on the idea that even within that very sort of Tolkien-esque universe, we put too much trust in appearances, and that while we've got the seemingly elf-like fair folk on one hand and the goblins on the other, Will starts to suspect that they're actually fighting on the wrong side. So so that's a fun book, and one of my publishers keeps badgering me to do another one in that series. There are some short stories. I just did a new short story for that. I don't know if you're aware of it, that Instinct anthology.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The first story in the book is a Will Hawthorne story. So I'm still writing some of the short stories connected to Will, and I will at some point probably do another novel.
Okay. Well, then I love his name, because it calls upon, between the first and last name, you've got two icons of literature. So I love that. Now,
right.
In 2012, we've got Tears of the Jaguar. Now, this one was this. Tell us a little bit about this one.
So Tears of the Jaguar sort of is a throwback to the Masqueratrius and those other books, right? And it actually involves one of the same characters. It's also a mystery thriller. It's a huge story, and it sort of hops all over the place. Part of it is set in Mexico, part of it is set in England, and it hinges on the discovery of a Mayan tomb, but some of the things in the Mayan tomb are not Mayan, and it creates this sort of sense of chaos and panic, because it looks like a much more recent murder has been sort of interred within the sort of pyramid base. And this was a book that was part of a big shift in my career in some ways, because it was right around the time that Penguin said, sorry, my dog is getting insistent. Sherlock, shh, be quiet. It was right around the time that Penguin was saying, people aren't buying these mystery thriller type things anymore, so we want you to do something else. So I had been sitting on that book for a while, and it stayed sort of on the back burner until I found a new publisher to take it, even though it was characters who'd been around in a previous story. Yeah. And there is a Shakespearean component in that one as well, kinda.
It's hard to stay away from those, isn't it?
They just, I mean, they say write what you know, or write what you love, or write who you are, or something. And there are certain things I just can't completely get away from. I think most of the time, if you are a Shakespeare fan, you'll spot those little half references, but most people who aren't won't even notice them and won't give it a second thought.
And so therefore they wouldn't say, oh, why is this here?
Right. I don't think, I hope not. And I
Yeah.
don't think people, it's not like, oh, you've got to be a Shakespeare fan to read these books. No, not at all.
But there are little Easter eggs occasionally for those of us who are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it.
Now, this was your first foray into fiction for the younger set, was it not?
Yeah, it was. It was. Yeah. So okay. So after after Penguin said they didn't want me to do archaeological thrillers, I thought, well, maybe I'll do something a little bit more conventional. And I was doing. I started writing a book about a crime scene photographer. It was sort of CSI-ish, and that, of course, was very popular at the time. So the publisher was enthusiastic about me doing that. And I started doing ride-alongs with the local police department, going to crime scenes. And unlike CSI, it's not a very glamorous thing, right? And most police departments, their CSI units, their crime scene units, are very small. And everything gets subcompartmentalized and you have to do all kinds of stuff. And so once I had passed my background check, they started giving me jobs. And I had a very distinct memory. I was out, it was like 3, maybe 4 in the morning. And I was at a scene where there had been a shooting. And I'm out there with my flashlight, following a blood trail. And, marking shell casings and such. And I thought, do I really want to do this? Because I'd written mystery thrillers, and obviously, like most people, I watch a lot of mystery thrillers on TV and I read them and stuff, and they're glamorous and clever and sexy and cool. And real murder is not.
Right.
And mostly from my experience, if I was trying to do something sort of authentic and urban, it was mostly just sad. It was mostly people in terrible social situations, and it was really quite depressing. It was bleak. And I found myself thinking, I don't want to live in this world. If writing this book means that I have to stay in this particular world, I don't want to do it. So I came home and I said to my wife, and I had a similar conversation with my agent, where I was like, you know what? I'm not going to do this anymore. And both of them said, okay, so what are you going to do instead? And I said, I'm going to write a book for my son, who at the time was about 7. And I think for me, it comes back to your first question. In some ways, it was me trying to sort of reconnect with the kind of stories that I had read when I was his age. Because you know what it's like when you're a parent, you sort of you remember what it was like to be a child, right? You start to see things through the eyes of your child and remember things and remember the surprise and the wonder and the joy of stuff that has become ordinary. And I thought, I want to write a book that taps into that. And I want it to have echoes of things like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or Alice in Wonderland, or any of those things that I read when I was young. So I wrote what in the US was called the Darwin Arkwright series. The first one was called Darwin, Arkwright, and the Peregrine Pact. The second was, there you go. And these were published by another Penguin house, Razorbill. And the second one was called Darwin, Arkwright, and the Insidious Black. And the third one was called Darwin, Arkwright, and the School of Shadows. They have recently all been reissued by a UK publisher under different titles. They're now called Monsters in the Mirror. And the premise of the books, the first book, was that it was about a kid who, an English boy who's moved to Atlanta, which is where I had been living, and was at some fancy private school where he didn't fit in, didn't belong. And then one day he finishes up in this odd shop in a mall, and the shopkeeper gives him a mirror, which, after the sun goes down, turns into a portal into this other world. And that world is slightly steampunky, but also very sort of nature-centered, and it's beautiful, and it's strange, and it's full of monsters trying to get out. And so Darwin then has to figure out why, and he discovers that he can cross through the mirror. He can get into this other world. And so he has to then make friends at school in order to sort of be a kind of mini army preventing the invasion of his environment by whatever is on the other side of the mirrors that might be coming through. So it's got a little sort of Harry Potter-ish, but it's got those other kind of elements as well. And, you know, like a lot of my stuff, including my stuff for kids, it has a sort of a seriousness to it, I think, underneath the fun and the playfulness. Hopefully it is fun and playful, but yeah, there's a little darkness to it as well. The UK editions, I don't know if you've seen them, but the new UK editions are absolutely gorgeous. They have a completely different approach to the cover art and the internal illustrations, and they're really lovely.
I haven't seen physical copies, but I've seen the pictures, and I agree, they really are nice.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, what was published next, anyway?
You've really done your homework, Carol. I'm impressed.
Well, thank you.
Right.
Your Macbeth, and followed by a Hamlet, which I don't have a physical copy of. So but you co-wrote this with David Hewson, and
right.
Tell us a little bit about what those two books, what you did with those.
So David Hewson is a British mystery writer, very successful, and I don't tend to go as much these days, but I used to go to the annual meeting of an organization called International Thriller Writers that meets in New York in the summer, and I a year or two beforehand, I had been approached by David Morrell, who was the author of Rambo: First Blood, who's in some ways the father of the American modern thriller, and Doug Preston of Preston and Child. And they were putting together a collection of essays about thrillers, and they wanted them to be written by modern thriller writers talking about thrillers that had influenced them or were in some ways important. And they came to me and they said, "We'd love you to do something on Shakespeare as a thriller writer." And I thought about it, and initially they wanted me to do Titus Andronicus, which I didn't want to do.
Oh,
yeah. And I said, "Well, what about Macbeth? Let me do something on Macbeth." So I wrote my little essay on Macbeth, and sometime later, the book came out. It's called 100 Must-Read Thrillers, and it was edited, or the foreword was by David Hewson, I think. I forget which. And International Thriller Writers organized a big signing in New York, and all the authors who were available came. They put us in a huge room and sat us at tables, and people came in to have their copies signed. And by accident of alphabet, I was sitting next to David Hewson. Hartley Hewson. And we were just chatting, waiting for the immense line in front of Lee Child to come to us. And at some point he said, "Well, I assume there's lots of retellings of Macbeth." said, yeah, and we talked about movie adaptations and things, but they all tended to be very contemporary, radical, And he said, no, but what about a modern retelling of a historical version of Macbeth, Sort of Game of Thrones type feel, right? Where
Gotcha.
it's a sort of a modern prose telling of a version of Shakespeare's story set in period. And I thought, I can't think of one, and it was a genuinely bizarre thing because we thought, oh, that might be quite interesting, And while we were talking, Steve Feldberg, who was the head of Audible at the time, was walking around, and he had done some work with David at some point, and he said, have you got any ideas for original content? We're looking for new things. And David said, what about a retelling of Macbeth in contemporary prose?
Just as a matter of fact, yeah.
Yeah. And Steve Feldberg said, well, that sounds interesting. So David and I then sort of, roughed up a proposal and did a couple of samples. And within a matter of weeks, we had a contract. And within maybe a couple of months, we had a first draft. And he was in the UK and I was in the US. And we were basically writing by email. And we sort of divided up the story in terms of which parts of it we were most interested in each. We had some conversations about how we wanted to approach the story, what it was that we wanted to do. And we made certain simple decisions, like we decided to like the Macbeths. Right? I mean, often on stage and in other kinds of adaptations, they're presented simply as villains, or Lady Macbeth is a villain, and we thought, we're not going to do that. So we came at it in the way that I would if I was directing, because I do a lot of stage work, and I would say, at the beginning of any rehearsal process, we would always say, why this play and why now? What are we going to do with this text that's going to make it feel urgent and present and fresh? Because I'm not interested, ironically, in archaeological Shakespeare. I'm not interested in doing museum quality productions. That doesn't do anything for me at all. A piece of theater should speak in the moment to an audience in ways that they find exciting and compelling, whatever it is. And we said, so we need to take that same approach to writing this novel. So we made certain decisions from the outset, and we said, so what are they doing? Why are they in this situation? And we at the same time started looking at the historical records, some of which Shakespeare used and some of which he didn't, some of which he sort of suggests within the play, and some of them he passes over. And we said, what can we do with this that will make it feel completely fresh and new? So, we can do the battles. Shakespeare can't do the battles because he's got like 4 guys with a couple of swords. He just can't do it, right? But we can do that. We can have this big, expansive combat stuff. We can take certain positions that get talked about in academic discourse about Lady Macbeth's lost child, for example. There's stuff within the play that people are constantly talking about the fact that the Macbeths are childless, and this is clearly one of the things that is driving them in some ways, but they haven't always been childless, right? So let's put that front and center and say, how does their relationship develop through losing a child? And what does that do to who they are, and what does that, So that was where it came from, and we wrote it. And certain things, because I had written semi-epic fantasy, I was doing all the battle stuff, and David, who does a lot of location and archaeology and architecture and things, he was also on the ground consult. So he would go up to Scotland and take lots of pictures and write sort of long narrative sections about landscape and place, right? Because Shakespeare's play is not particularly Scottish, right? It's set in Scotland, but it doesn't feel especially Scottish
Right.
in some ways. So we wanted to get to that. So we wrote it between us, and the time difference made a huge difference because the UK is 5 hours ahead. So I'd wake up in the morning and there's bloody 10 pages from Houston. So then
So
I have to write.
challenge, right?
Yes. So we were literally going back and forth like that. And then when it was done, we spent a little time editing each other. And we just said, whatever you think doesn't work, we have the right to basically nix anything that we don't think is working in the other person's writing. And then we tried to sort of normalize the voice, so that each section didn't stand out as being the work of one person. And then we handed it off to Audible, and they had to then find a good narrator. And in this case, we went through a few possibilities and settled on Alan Cumming.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's perfect.
Right. So he does the book in his sort of natural Scottish brogue, and it's kind of brilliant, and I mean, his performance is brilliant, and it makes the text feel so rich and complex and great. And so they were very enthusiastic about it. It was very successful for Audible, and the copy that you have, the physical copy, came out as a kind of afterthought. But it was written expressly for audio first. And then we did a Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, a novel, and that was performed by Richard Armitage. And likewise, very successful. So, and Falstaff Books has just done a hard copy of the Hamlet novel. That's why you don't have it, but I'm sure John Hartness will try to sell you one.
I'm sure he will. I will have to get in touch with him. Yes. Thank you for that.
But I do, I love audiobooks, and I do recommend with those books, I think, they're great to do as audiobooks because the performances are so strong and because they were originally written with the audio performance in mind.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I will have to give it a try. Now, your next published work, then, something else I don't have physical copies of, the Steeplejack series. So what can you tell us about
that? So the Steeplejack series are set. I was traveling a lot. I was spending some time in South Africa, and the Steeplejack series came out of two contrary impulses. I had wanted to write a novel that was sort of a Victorian gas lamp, Sherlock Holmesy kind of thriller, right? Set in a sort of British metropolis, maybe somewhere closer to where I grew up, like Manchester, rather than London. And I wanted it to be very industrial and working class, which is my background. And I had this idea of centering of my main character being a steeplejack. And a steeplejack is somebody who works on very tall buildings. And in the medieval period, it meant cathedrals and churches, right? Hence steeple. But by the Victorian period, they worked almost exclusively on factory chimneys. And so they would have to climb these very tall buildings and chimneys to perform maintenance on them. And when I was a kid in Lancashire, there were still steeplejacks who worked the old-fashioned way, just with ropes and ladders and climbing. And some of these chimneys were 200, 300, even 400 feet high. So extraordinary, yeah. And so I was fascinated by this, and I thought it would be really interesting for a kind of detective story to have somebody who had the particular skills for climbing and agility and that kind of stuff, but also who was used to sort of being unnoticed and looking at the city with this sort of, from this high angle all the time. At the same time, I was trying to write this sort of quasi-African fantasy story that involved shape shifting and various other things. And I couldn't find my way into it exactly. And then one day I woke up and thought, well, what if these two stories are actually the same story? What if I take my Victorian metropolis and I put it in a world that looks like Victorian South Africa, and I create a city that never existed, model it on somewhere like Durban, and have all this sort of very Victorian sensibility and the Victorian architecture and structures, but build this multi-ethnic community around it and have it surrounded by savannah with lions and elephants and stuff, or things like them. And I was thinking about this also, particularly. I say Durban. Durban's a fascinating city because it has a huge Indian population. That a lot of Indians who were basically brought from India by the British colonial powers to build their version of what they wanted South Africa to be. So a city like Durban has had a ruling white minority, a much larger Black indigenous population, and an imported Indian workforce who were in many ways sort of indentured servants,
Right.
And this was in the, 2014, something like that. And I was looking at what was going on in our own political landscape and seeing the lead into some big elections and the way that racial politics were becoming this sort of visible and contentious force within our own world. And I thought, that's what I want to write about. But I want to write it in this sort of fantasy world, so I'm seeing it through a kind of distorting lens. I'm not writing a sort of contemporary, political thriller, but that's what it's going to be. So my protagonist, whose name is Anglet Sutanga, is the steeplejack who gets caught up in a sort of murder mystery, which has massive political implications for her community in Barcelona, in this as a world that looks kind of like South Africa, but isn't exactly. And they are slightly fantastical. They have some sort of steampunky kind of elements and some versions of wildlife and such, which is not exactly ours, but not magic. And they work as mystery thrillers. And they were very well received. The first one won International Thriller Writers YA Book of the Year in whatever that was, 2016 or so, which was a huge deal for me.
Certainly, congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that was like one of the great nights of my life as a writer, So I was very proud of those books. I actually just got an email the other day from somebody who said a new book has just come out about representation of women of color in fantasy literature, and there's a chapter on steeplejack in it, which sounds really cool.
Wow, that's great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Now I have the publication dates for those as 16, 17, and 18.
Right. So yeah, and this was tour. Yeah. So I remember, when I turned in the first book, it was done, but with the sort of editing process and the way that they market, it was 2 years before it came out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, around that same time, you also began another collaboration with Tom DeLonge, and you have a couple of different series with him, which I don't have, again, physical copies of, The Secret Machines and Planet of Blood and Ice.
The Cathedrals of Glass series, yeah.
Yeah, and so what can you tell us about those?
So Tom DeLonge is the lead singer of Blink-182, who some of you will know as a kind of pop punk, slightly emo-y band from the
slightly emo. I like that. I've never heard them described that way.
I mean, some of the best stuff I think is quite emo-y, but
Yeah.
sort of very late 90s, 2000s, and Tom has his own sort of publicity, a sort of a media company, and he's very into UFOs and paranormal phenomena of one kind or another. And he approached me as wanting to work on this big, expansive novel series called The Secret Machines. Secret spelt with a K, and which are a sort of it's a coherent story, but it's massive. It's one of these. When we first talked about it, and I was like, "So, what do you want this to be about?" And he said, "Everything." And I'm like,
Oh, that's
"Okay."
easy. Sure.
And I'm like, "And what period is it set in?" And he's like, "All of them." In what place? Everywhere. It's a book about the world, man. And I was like, "Okay,
Uh,
I don't know how to do this."
it shows you
But we
the
did.
different approach to writing song lyrics and writing novels, right?
Yeah, I mean, Tom is a very sort of he gets images, he gets ideas, he gets big sort of broad concept stuff, and then he's like, okay, turn this into a narrative. And I'm like, okay, so that means I need to create actual characters and plot lines and stories and stuff. And then I'll sort of pitch him ideas and we'll work together that way. It's very different from when I was working with David Hewson, where we were literally writing half the book each. Working with Tom's not like that at all. I'm doing the writing on a sentence level, and he's throwing ideas at me. And I've just had a conversation with General such and body, and he says this is what this particular UFO recording is, and blah blah blah. So then I'm going to incorporate that, and then I send him ideas. I send him an outline, and then I'll write the whole thing, and he'll respond and send me editorial notes and so on. So it's a very different kind of process. But yeah, so we've done the first two of the Secret Machines books. People keep asking for the third one, and I can't write it until I get the go ahead.
Right.
And we also have a series called The Cathedrals of Glass. The first one is Planet of Blood and Ice, which is a story about a more sort of conventional sci-fi story. Secret Machines is set on this Earth, obviously, and most of it follows events and a story that sort of takes off at the end of the Second World War and involves UFO sightings. Cathedrals of Glass is a sort of futuristic thing set on a completely different place, where a group of 10 teen delinquents are sent off to a moon for some sort of re-education, because they are considered deviant in some ways. And the ship crash lands on a planet which is supposed to be uninhabited and turns out not to be. And I would call that, it's sci-fi, but it's more of a sort of psychological thriller. And it's quite spooky. It's closer to horror than most of my other stuff. So there are 2 books in that series as well. There will be a third, but as with most of my things, each story is kind of self-contained, even within a series. So there's a beginning and an end to each book. And if you choose to go on with those characters in that world, then you can. But if you don't, you have a complete product.
Right. Okay. All right. Now we will move on to a book I love.
Oh, right.
Bath Street, yes, with this great cover and the great illustrations inside, which there's
Yeah.
I don't know how well it'll show up in the
Yeah.
But so tell us a little bit about that one. I know that you actually grew up in this area that you write about. So.
Yeah, and that was kind of key to the concept from the outset, that after writing the Steeplejack books, I kind of wanted to write another YA of some sort, but I wanted the Steeplejack books were very clearly not about me, right? They were about a
Right.
world and a perspective that I didn't entirely get, right? They're not. It's not my story. So coming out of that, I thought, if I'm going to write another YA, I want it to be something where I feel like I'm drawing on my own experience. And I took that very literally and said, so I want to write a book that's set in my hometown in Preston, in Lancashire. And it's set in the late 1970s when I was about 15 or so. And I want it to grow out of the ghost stories that I grew up with. And so that's what it is. So and the premise of the book is that the main character is 15 and he's coming home from scouts one evening and he gets attacked by something and killed. He dies in the first chapter and he's then a ghost. And what that means in this world is that he's the only person in the town. Everybody, all the living people are gone. The town is frozen in the exact moment that it was at the moment of his death. And he can only go to places that he went to in life. And over time, he starts to forget them. And as he forgets them, the world gets smaller. And he's not the only ghost there. There are others, and some of them are dangerous. So part of the fun idea that I was trying to play with was, if your character's already dead at the beginning, how much worse can it get? And
It gets a lot worse.
And it can be a lot worse. Yeah. But yeah, the impulse was drawing on versions of stories that I had heard and been scared by when I was a kid, some of which were very specifically local or local versions of other kinds of ghost stories. So I wrote that, and that audiobook is done by Christopher Eccleston.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay. Yeah, that's great. And it does have a sequel, right? The Written Stone Lane.
It was written to be completely self-contained, and they kept saying, because the book did very well locally, and they kept saying, we want another, we want another. And I kept saying, it's finished. I don't have anything else to say. And then one day I thought, maybe there is.
Maybe.
And it's interesting because, having not wanted to write a sequel, I then wrote, for the only time in my life, in some ways, an absolutely true sequel, in the sense that the last lines of book one are the first lines of book two.
Okay.
Picks up in the same moment and goes from there, So yeah, and Written Stone Lane is also, set in the area. It's set, there is Written Stone Lane, this is close to where my mother lives, and there is a big slab of stone, and carved into the stone is a date. I think it's 1661, and it says, Ralph Radcliffe laid this stone to lie forever. If you can't get a story out of that, you need to hang it up.
Well, it sounds very intriguing. I have not read that one yet, so I will have to get a hold of that one.
Yeah.
Now, your next book, when it came out, I thought I would show I don't know how well that'll come out on the.
Yeah, that was not. I think that was not my next book, but we can talk about that one. Because are you aware that I also write as Andrew Hart?
I had forgotten that. I mean, I came across that, but okay. Yeah. Well, tell us what your next book was then.
So as Andrew Hart, I wrote two domestic mystery thrillers, realist, contemporary. The first was called Lies That Bind Us, and the second was called The Woman in Our House.
Oh God, that's not spooky.
and I mean, it sounds spooky. It's not spooky in a sort of fantasy sense. The woman in our house in this case is a nanny who is not who she says she is.
Okay. So, but they know she's there.
Oh yeah. Some of the time they know she's there.
At least something,
yeah.
We don't want that other.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Okay, we have those two under Andrew Hart, and then we have Impervious. I don't know.
Then we have Impervious. Yeah.
Why? There we go. Without the glare. It's a great cover, but I happen to have the e-copy rather than a physical, but I wanted to make sure and show that. And that again was a very came out of a very personal experience. I don't know how much you want to say about that. You discuss it in the book, but
Yeah,
um, or
it's
in the
difficult.
afterward.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's tough to talk about for a couple of reasons, not least of which is that I don't want to completely give the book away.
right,
Uh,
right. But it's based
but
upon an experience you had. Let's put it that
yeah,
way.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's based on, yeah, and it's set up as a fantasy novel with a young teen girl who is into fantasy and sci-fi and such, and seems to get sucked into this world where she becomes a kind of champion, sort of a Buffy-esque figure, right? But and Buffy gets mentioned a few times in that book.
yes, it does. Yes, points to you for that, by the way.
Um, but in the course of the story, we start to realize that something else is going on that is not paranormal.
Right.
Um, and maybe I'll leave it at that. But yeah, it
Gotcha.
grew out of a particular experience. Yeah,
And it's an excellent book, and I got to tell you, very very suspenseful. So um,
and
anyway,
short,
yeah, that's true.
short is
It
key.
is fairly short. Yes,
I wrote
and
it. I wrote it in 13 days. The first draft.
oh wow, that's
Mm.
crazy. Well, good for you.
Yeah, it was, as I say, it came out of a sort of traumatic experience, and it was one of those things where I had to get it out somehow, and
Right,
so
right,
I literally did nothing except eat and sleep, and not much of that,
right.
until it was done. Yeah, yeah.
Well, then you've got something that's a tad lighter that just came out last year. Then you mentioned it earlier, Burning Shakespeare, and you
Oh,
told us
right.
a bit about the gist of that one. And I've got to say, much like Shakespeare itself, I mean, reading the works of Shakespeare, you do a great job of combining the humor and the more serious philosophical kinds of concerns, even if they're not presented in a serious way. It's
Right.
hard to take somebody like Bliss particularly seriously, but I mean, you have to, but in any case, it's a lot of fun. And that one I also have an e-copy of. I should pull up the cover of that because it's got a great cover. I
Yes.
need to get a physical copy of that one just because I think it would be fun to have. So, but I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add about that you didn't say earlier, but
I mean, it's one of the things about Burning Shakespeare was that it was a book that I had been trying to write for about 20 years. Um, and I struggled with it because it was so much of the content was so close to my day job,
right,
and I had to keep sort of stopping myself from going into lecture mode. Let me explain to you something
right,
interesting about Shakespeare. It's like, well, but that's not what a novel is supposed to do. So I kept changing the story to try and find a way I could all Shakespeare stuff could be done sort of subtextually and as a sort of side, almost in the margins. I wanted the main plot to work as a novel that was compelling by itself. Um, and it took me a while to find that. And some of that, I think, was about taking seriously the idea that people might want to get rid of Shakespeare, and
hmm,
why, and there are good reasons and there are bad reasons. And taking them seriously gave me a different way to think about what that story was, and try to sort of wrestle with why people might think, what, maybe we'd be better off without it.
yeah, that which would be that would I can't even I I can't even imagine. So, and then you had something that's kind of fun. I know you wrote well one of the essays in it, but you are the editor of Shakespeare and Geek Culture,
Oh,
uh,
yes.
which was I'm sure an interesting process too to gather all of these folks together and how can you just give us give us a brief idea of what that one is all about. Although I think it's probably fairly obvious from the title.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously that's not a novel. That's a fairly serious academic essay collection, which I co-edited with Peter Holland from the University of Notre Dame. And it began as a Shakespeare Association seminar where we had, I forget, 20 participants or something, of people who come in and they're Shakespeareans, they're academics by trade. And we wanted people to think about Shakespeare in terms of other things, such as fantasy and sci-fi, but also thinking about the way that we as academics geek out about Shakespeare, and turn each of these chapters of the book into a study of that, or the ways that, I mean, I wrote a piece that did for quite a bit with Tolkien's attitude to Shakespeare, for example, and our attitude to Tolkien, and so on. So yeah, I think it's a fairly for an academic collection. I think it's fairly approachable, and it was very frustrating for me at the time that Arden, which is part of Bloomsbury, refused to do a sort of a very affordable edition, because it was one of those rare academic books that I thought this might actually sell to fans of sci-fi and fantasy, because there is stuff on Buffy and Tolkien and Doctor Who and all kinds of stuff built into it, in terms of the way these things intersect with Shakespeare somewhat. And so, when they say, yeah, here's the book, it's $100. And you're like, what? What is that? But this is the way academic publishing functions, because they assume they're only going to sell to academic libraries. So there is now a paperback version of that, which is much more affordable. It's like $20 or something. So
fun stuff. Well, now, what can you tell us? You have a new book coming out right before DragonCon, as a matter of fact. And what can you tell us about that one?
I do. I have I haven't really talked about it publicly yet, but
are you allowed
I have a
to?
new book. Yes, I think so. Yeah. It's called Hideki Smith, Demon Queller. And it's a book that I mentioned before that I used to live in Japan. My wife is Japanese American. My son is mixed race. And this is, again, a version of a story that I've been kicking around for a very, very long time. And my wife and son are listed as co-writers on this book. And it's a story about a mixed race kid and his sister being raised in rural North Carolina and not quite fitting in a small town. And they've grown up sort of separate from the Japanese part of their heritage, because their parents have sort of suppressed that to try and make them fit in better, which hasn't really worked very well. And then one day, a series of strange things happen, and Caleb, his name, he goes by Caleb. His middle name is Hideki, but everybody calls him Caleb. And he acquires these weird ancestral powers. And his sister, Emily, starts accidentally tapping into something in her heritage, which frequently leaves her turning into a fox, literal fox, which is not always a good thing.
Yeah, especially if you can't control when it happens.
Exactly. But these things are triggered by the emergence of something strange in the mountains, which is somewhat bizarre. It's complicated, and there are reasons that they don't discover for a long time. But this strange supernatural presence in the mountains is rooted in ancient Japanese folklore and monsters. So that's the book, and it's called Hideki Smith, Demon Queller, and it will come out immediately before DragonCon, and we're hoping to do some events of some kind while we're there, and I think I'm going to do something on the Silk Road track. I'll be doing something on the Silk Road track anyway, because I think we're going to do a baby metal panel again. One of my abiding interests is in Japanese rock music, and I have a YouTube channel dedicated to that. And I just found out, this is unbelievable, that for the first time in like 4 years, baby metal are playing in the US, and they're playing in Atlanta DragonCon weekend.
Ah, okay. Well, we need to make sure and carve out that time frame for you to not schedule you for anything during that
Yeah,
time.
I mean, I'm trying to get them to see if they can bring the band into the convention at some point, but I think that's a long shot.
Yeah, that would be nice though. That would I think they would be an interesting addition. So you never know,
Yeah.
how these things will work out. So,
Mm.
but we look forward to it, and I'll tell all of our viewers that I've had a little sneak peek of it, and I really like Hideki's voice.
Right.
I
Thank you.
really do. I'm very excited about it. So congratulations.
Thanks. I'm excited about it as well.
Now I do have a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
I know that you've been going for a while, and you may get tired of answering all these questions, but there are a few things that I would like to know. And one of them that's a burning question for me, which occurred to me last night. I thought, oh, I've got to ask AJ this. What are some of your favorite, if you had to pick a favorite Shakespeare play out of, like, what's your favorite tragedy, what's your favorite comedy, and what's your favorite history? If you're able to do that, can you pick one?
Yeah. My favorite tragedy to teach is Macbeth,
Okay.
because people think they know it and they don't. So that's
Okay.
my favorite Shakespeare play, my favorite tragedy to come back to and read, however, is probably Hamlet, just because I constantly find new things. This is the problem when you ask a Shakespearean these questions. One of my favorite tragedies to watch is Antony and Cleopatra, which I think is a really interesting contemporary play, because of the way that it talks about two completely alien worlds to each other, and the way that the characters are sort of caught in the middle. And I'm a fan is the wrong word, but I do love King Lear, but it's a hard one.
Yeah.
It's a hard play to watch, but when it's done well, man, yeah. Okay, so tragedies. Comedies. My favorite comedies are probably Twelfth Night and Midsummer Night's Dream.
Okay.
Both of which I think are really rich, complex plays. Midsummer Night's Dream is another great play to teach, because again, people think they know it and they don't, and it's so much darker and more interesting than people think it is. But I just love the sort of the playfulness of it and the fantasy of it. And Twelfth Night I love because it's in some ways the first of the middle comedies to really embrace the idea of leaving people out of the happy ending. That some people get what they want and a lot don't. And I think it's sort of psychologically really rich and melancholy play. I love that. What else? Histories. Henry IV is great to teach. Henry V is a wonderful play on stage if approached intelligently, and not as simply a sort of jingoistic nationalistic thing, which I don't think it is at all. It's a really complicated play and a really interesting play. But yeah, I love that. And of the sort of film versions of it, I think it's Kenneth Branagh's best Shakespeare film. It is also his first. And part of the reason it's his best is because he's just come out of an RSC production directed by Adrian Noble, and all of that goes into that film. I think it's really good. What does that leave us with? So I guess romances, the final plays. I mean, and I would add this just because I think my all-time favorite Shakespeare play is probably The Winter's Tale.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so that's one of those sort of late romances that has this sort of supernatural through line to it, but ultimately is this really complex and interesting study of forgiveness and redemption. I think it's a fascinating play. I really love it. Of all the plays to see in the theater, it's the one where I find myself emotionally most vulnerable watching it.
Okay. Now it makes me want to go back and read it. I've never seen that one on stage.
Yeah.
So we've talked about Shakespeare. So let's, if you have to pick one of your own books, do you have a favorite amongst your own books that you really enjoyed, either the writing of or the final result, or is it just too hard to pick?
I mean, in all honesty, I'm not being cute. My favorite book is always the last one I wrote, because that's the
Okay.
one I'm most
Yeah.
invested in. You know, I
Right.
never write something that I'm not going to completely soak myself in and inject everything that I care about goes into those books. And so right now, my favorite book is Hideki Smith, and that
Oh
sounds like
yeah.
a marketing trick, but it's not. But I do think that, you know, as with some of the books that you mentioned, with Burning Shakespeare and with Impervious and with Hideki, these are very, very personal books for me. They're books that have grown directly out of my own sort of personal experience and things that I've been invested in and ideas that I've been wrestling with for a very, very long time. Cold Bath Street as well, actually, I would put in that same category. These are really personal books. Cold Bath, I mean, I didn't mention it before, but, you know, the Cold Bath Street was also written when my father was dying. And so that sort of immersion in the town that I grew up in and
Right.
those experiences and wrestling with ideas of mortality and so on. I think, you know, that was also, even though I don't think that very, very personal stuff is going to come across to most readers, but it's there and it drives the story. So yeah, the stuff that is closest to my own
Right.
experience is, you know, so.
Well, that's good that you feel that way, that you're satisfied, or that you have, that those feelings of satisfaction after having done it. That's a good reason for doing it right there.
Right.
And now for my last question is kind of a craft question. And I'm just curious. I ask most people this, is when you're actually writing, do you prefer absolute quiet, or do you like some kind of background sound, or going on while you're writing, or does it change? Does it vary?
It may vary a little, but for the most part, I want and need silence.
Oh,
I
okay.
occasionally I see writers on Facebook and stuff saying, "What kind of music do you listen to when you're writing?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about? No, 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 no. The music has to come from the words, right?"
Right.
And particularly, I cannot deal with anything that has lyrics or anything like that,
Right.
because then I'm going to obsess about that. Or worse, I'm not going to be conscious that I'm obsessing about it, and it's going to start to affect what I'm writing. And then I'm not in control of my own medium, in which case, no. So, I mean, I'm a little bit more flexible than I used to be. I can write in different places. I can write on trains and planes and such when I have to, but not for extended periods. And for the most part, or a couple of rooms in the house, that's where I write. If I have to
Gotcha.
write in a hotel room, I can, but I'm a creature of habit, and I like to be able to just focus on that. And when it's working, I can, when I'm sitting there, I'll sit down to write, and then I'll glance at my watch, and I've been there, 5 hours or something. And then,
Right, right.
yeah, yeah.
Time flies. Yes.
Mm,
Well, AJ, I want to thank you so much for being here today and answering all of my many questions.
my
Uh,
pleasure.
and I really look forward to getting back to Hideki Smith, and and I look forward to seeing you at Dragon Con. And some of our viewers are people who probably won't be at con, but many of them will, and we will look forward to having all of them come and ask you questions and get your book, all of
Absolutely.
that good stuff. So I do want to thank you, and I do want to thank our viewers, whether you are familiar with AJ before or you are brand new. I hope that this will give you an idea of what you could expect from his wonderful books. So again, thank you so much, AJ. Thanks to all our viewers, and I look forward to seeing you in, gosh, just a few months from now.
Mm,
Take
thank
care,
you.
and thank you.